My name is Raymond Ellis. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in the same house that my wife and I bought almost 50 years ago when we were still young enough to believe that all the decades ahead of us would stretch endlessly and generously. The neighborhood has changed. The people have changed. The world itself has turned into something I sometimes barely recognize, but this house remains almost the same. The creak of the stairs, the draft from the kitchen window, the way the sun hits, the living room in the late afternoon. After my wife, Margaret, passed away 8 years ago, I thought I would eventually learn to fill the silence. But silence is not something that fills, it only expands, and I have grown used to living with it the way one learns to live with an old wound, that never truly heals but no longer bleeds. My days are predictable, perhaps to some people unbearably so, but routine has become my shield against despair. I rise around 6 every morning, put on the kettle and grind the coffee beans by hand, because the noise and the smell somehow remind me of mornings when Margaret would hum in the kitchen. I make 2 slices of toast, one for myself, and out of stubborn habit, I still make a second one that usually goes uneaten, though sometimes I feed it to the birds outside. After breakfast, I sit by the window and read the newspaper, though I no longer believe in half the words that are printed there, and then I take a slow walk to the small park a few blocks away, leaning on the cane that I only reluctantly admitted I needed last year. People often assume that an old man's life is defined by forgetfulness, but my memory is sharper than ever, perhaps because I spend so much time replaying the past, revisiting moments and faces that no one else recalls anymore. I remember Margaret's laugh, the way it filled a room and disarmed any tension. I remember my daughter Elaine as a child running barefoot across the backyard, her hair tangled in the wind, shouting that she would never grow up, that she wanted to stay small forever. I remember the first time I held my grandson, how tiny his hand was, how he gripped my finger as if I were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. These memories are what sustain me, even though they sometimes hurt more than they comfort, because they remind me of everything that has been lost, not just Margaret, but the closeness of a family that has gradually drifted away as if carried by a current too strong for me to fight. Elaine visits, or rather, she used to visit more often in the first years after her mother's death, but as time passed, the visits became shorter, more rushed, more perfunctory, as though she were fulfilling an obligation. She has her own life, her own children, her husband, Peter, and I do not expect to be the center of their universe. Yet there is a sting when I realize that weeks, then months, go by without anyone stepping through my door. I phone sometimes, but the conversations are clipped, filled with phrases like, "We're busy, Dad, I'll call you back," or "We'll come by soon," promises that rarely materialize. I try not to take it personally, but loneliness magnifies every absence, every silence, until it feels like rejection. When they do come, I try to present myself as cheerful, capable, not wanting to be a burden. But the truth is that I see in their eyes a mixture of impatience and condescension, as if they have already decided who I am and what I am capable of. Physically, I am slower, yes, but my mind is intact, and I cling to that with all my might. I keep my accounts in order. I pay my bills on time. I still read novels and write in a journal every night. I know some of my peers in the neighborhood have succumbed to dementia, and I sometimes overhear whispers comparing me to them. But I resist that label because I know the difference between being cautious and being confused. The problem is that once people decide you are old, they also decide you must be incapable. It begins with small things. Someone speaking louder than necessary, someone taking a paper out of your hand because you'll only misplace it, someone telling you what you like or don't like as though you are no longer qualified to judge your own. Preferences. These are small indignities, but they accumulate, and after a while they feel like stones filling your pockets, dragging you down. My house itself has become both sanctuary and prison. It shelters me, surrounds me with memories, but it also emphasizes my solitude. Every object reminds me of conversations that will never be repeated, laughter that has vanished into air. I sometimes catch myself speaking aloud, pretending Margaret is in the next room, just to hear the sound of a voice in these walls. I am not delusional. I know she is gone, yet the ritual comforts me. Perhaps Elaine would call it unhealthy. Perhaps Peter would laugh. But they don't live in this silence. They don't understand how it can press against your ribs until you feel you might suffocate if you don't find some way to break it. There is also the matter of finances. Margaret and I were careful savers, and after decades of work, I spent my life as a schoolteacher, I have enough to live comfortably, though not extravagantly. I never thought this would be an issue, but I have noticed lately that Elaine asks more questions about my accounts than about my health. She frames it as concern, saying, "Dad, you shouldn't have to worry about bills at your age," or "Maybe Peter can help manage some of your paperwork." But I cannot shake the suspicion that their concern is less about me and more about what they might inherit, or even gain sooner if I were convinced to sign over responsibilities. Perhaps I am unfair. Perhaps I am simply paranoid. But old age sharpens your instinct for when people see you as a person and when they see you as a liability or an asset. The grandchildren, Matthew and Chloe, are kind enough, but they have absorbed the attitudes of their parents. They are polite, sometimes even affectionate. Yet I notice the way they exchange glances when I repeat a story, or when I misplace my glasses. I can hear them whisper that Grandpa is getting worse, though they say it with the casual cruelty of youth, not realizing how deeply words can cut when they come from the mouths of those you once carried on your shoulders. I try not to resent them. They are young. They do not understand what it means to be old, but it pains me all the same to realize that they are being taught to laugh at me rather than respect me. I tell myself that I am still strong, still capable, and in many ways I am. I cook, I clean, I take care of my yard. I volunteer occasionally at the local library helping children with reading, and in those moments I feel useful, connected, human. But each time I return home, each time I hear the clock ticking in the empty house, I am reminded of how precarious my place in this family has become. I am no longer sure whether they see me as a father, a grandfather, or merely as an obstacle on the path to something they desire. I do not want to believe that, because to believe it would mean admitting that the love I poured into my family all these years has been eroded by selfishness and impatience. Still, doubt gnaws at me, especially in the quiet hours of night when sleep refuses to come and every memory sharpens into accusation. This is my life as it stands at the beginning of this story. A man surrounded by objects heavy with memory, carrying both pride in his independence and fear of being slowly erased. I wake each day determined to assert that I am still here, still whole, even as the people I love most act as though my decline is inevitable. I sense, though, that something is approaching, some shift that will force me either to surrender to their narrative of who I am, or to fight for the truth of myself, no matter how painful that fight might become. It happened one evening when Elaine insisted that we should all gather for dinner at her house, something that had become increasingly rare over the last few years. She called it a family night, though I suspected it was more Peter's idea than hers, because he had always been the one to suggest that it was good for appearances when his in-laws were seen around. I went willingly, because any invitation to sit at the same table with my daughter and grandchildren felt like a chance to re-enter their world, however briefly, and I told myself not to expect too much, not to measure their warmth against the kind I once knew when Margaret was alive and family dinners were occasions filled with laughter rather than tension. I dressed carefully, putting on the jacket Margaret had once bought for me on our anniversary, and polished my shoes until the leather shone, because dignity is something you hold on to even when no one else notices it. When I arrived, the house was full of noise. Matthew was sprawled on the couch with his phone, Chloe was chattering with a friend on speaker, Elaine was in the kitchen moving briskly, and Peter sat with a drink already in his hand. At first, everything seemed almost normal. We ate roast chicken and potatoes, the kind of meal Elaine knew I liked, though she complained that she had almost no time to cook anymore. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking Matthew about his studies and Chloe about her new job, but they answered distractedly, their eyes never leaving their screens for long. Peter filled the silences with comments about work, about property prices, about taxes, and I nodded politely, even when I felt excluded from the flow of the conversation. I was about to say something about a book I had just finished when I heard Elaine laugh softly and whisper something to her husband. At first I thought nothing of it, but then she said more clearly, though still under the assumption that I couldn't hear, "He doesn't even listen anymore. Half the time he doesn't know what we're talking about." Peter chuckled and replied, "That's true. We might as well be speaking another language. Makes things easier when we need to discuss arrangements." I froze inside, though I kept my face still. I sat at the same table, the food cooling on my plate, and realized with a jolt that they were speaking about me as if I were absent, as if I were deaf, invisible, or already half gone from this world. Elaine leaned closer to Peter and added in a low but not low enough voice, "We'll have to get the papers sorted soon. It'll be easier once we establish that he can't manage on his own." Peter nodded, sipping his drink with that smirk I had always mistrusted. "Better, sooner than later. Otherwise, the house will just sit there, and the accounts too. We can't keep waiting." Their laughter followed, a short burst of shared amusement at my expense, as though stripping me of my autonomy was a practical joke between them. The words hit me with more force than I could describe. I had suspected before that they looked at me as a burden, but to hear it spoken aloud, to hear my own daughter reduce me to a problem to be solved, was like a knife cutting through the last threads of trust I had managed to preserve. I wanted to confront them right then, to slam my hand on the table and say, "I hear you, every single word." But something inside me stopped. Instead, I kept my expression mild. I even nodded at something Chloe said about her friend's vacation, though my ears burned and my hands trembled under the table. I understood in that moment that if I revealed my awareness too soon, they would retreat, deny, cover their tracks, and I would lose the only chance to know how far their intentions stretched. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, their words echoing in my head over and over again. "He doesn't even listen anymore. Get the papers sorted. Can't manage on his own." They believed I was deaf, absent-minded, incapable. That assumption gave me an advantage, though it was a bitter one. I left their house politely, thanked Elaine for the meal, even kissed my granddaughter on the cheek, though she barely looked up from her phone. But inside I was seething, not just with anger but with a sharp, clear determination that I had not felt in years. When I returned home, I did not go to bed right away. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen and wrote down every word I remembered, every phrase, every detail of their conversation. My handwriting shook, but my memory was precise. I dated the page, underlined the phrases, and added a note to myself. "Do not forget. They think you cannot hear. Use this." It was the first entry in what would become a secret record, my own shield against the erosion of truth. That night I walked through each room of my house and felt both a terrible dread and a fierce possessiveness. This was the home Margaret and I had built together, where we had raised Elaine, where we had laughed and fought and reconciled, where every wall held our history. To imagine it being taken from me under the pretense that I was no longer fit to live in it was unbearable. I swore then and there that I would not allow them to reduce me to a silent figure shuffled off to some sterile institution, while they divided what I had earned through a lifetime of work and sacrifice. The next few days I acted as though nothing had happened, though inside I was on high alert. I let Elaine believe I was forgetful. I allowed Peter to speak slowly and loudly as though addressing a child, but all the while I was listening, noting, remembering. Each casual remark about how much longer can he stay alone, each sideways glance when I paused to find my keys, I wrote it all down. The more I observed, the clearer their plan became, and the more resolute I grew. They might think me feeble, but they underestimated the sharpness of a man who has lived long enough to know betrayal when he hears it. What had once been vague unease solidified into certainty that evening at the dinner table. The catalyst had been their laughter, the dismissive cruelty of people who no longer saw me as a father or even as a man, but as an inconvenience. And if they believed that my age and solitude made me powerless, they were gravely mistaken. That night marked the beginning of my quiet resistance, the moment I decided I would no longer simply endure whatever treatment they gave me, but would instead gather, prepare, and wait for the chance to reveal that I heard every word, remembered every slight, and would not be erased so easily. In the weeks that followed that dinner, the air around me seemed to change, though perhaps what changed was not the world itself but the way I now perceived every word, every gesture, every carefully arranged smile from my daughter and her husband. Once you realize people are speaking about you as though you are not present, you begin to notice the subtleties you had ignored before, the coded looks, the pauses in conversation when you enter a room, the sudden shifts in tone when you ask a question. It was as if their laughter that night had opened a door into a hidden reality, and now I could see clearly that everything I had once taken for occasional thoughtlessness was part of a larger pattern designed to undermine me. Elaine began to drop comments that might have sounded innocent to someone less attentive. Remarks like, "Dad, maybe you should stop handling your bills. It must be confusing for you at this age." Or, "We don't want you to strain yourself with paperwork. Just sign and let Peter take care of it." Each time I would smile faintly, as though too slow to realize what she was asking, but in my mind I recorded the words like evidence in a trial. There were visits to the house that felt increasingly like inspections rather than family gatherings. Elaine would wander through the rooms, straightening photographs, opening drawers under the pretext of helping me organize, commenting on how dusty certain shelves looked, as though measuring my capacity to maintain the place. Peter was less subtle. He would shake his head at the state of the roof or the age of the appliances and then sigh, saying, "It's really not suitable for someone alone, is it?" He would say it not to me, but to Elaine, while I sat right there, as if I were already invisible, as if my opinion had no weight. I remember one afternoon when he looked directly at her, not at me, and said, "Sooner or later he won't be able to manage. We should start planning ahead." My own daughter nodded while I sat in silence, a ghost in my own home, clenching my hands beneath the table to stop them from shaking with rage. Even the grandchildren began to echo this narrative, though they may have done so without full awareness. Matthew once laughed when I misplaced my reading glasses and said, "See, Mom, you're right, he's slipping." Chloe giggled and added, "We'll have to put labels on everything for him." They thought it was a harmless joke, but to me it was confirmation that the story was spreading, that I was being recast in their minds not as their grandfather but as a caricature of frailty. What pained me most was that Elaine did not correct them, did not remind them that I had once carried them on my shoulders, taught them to ride their bicycles, paid for their music lessons and trips, but instead she smiled indulgently, as if encouraging them to see me through her own lens of condescension. One evening, Peter arrived with a folder under his arm, the kind of folder you recognize instantly as containing legal or financial documents. He spoke to me in that patient, deliberate tone reserved for children or the infirm, saying, "Ray, this is just some routine paperwork, nothing to worry about, just signatures to make things easier for everyone." I asked what it was for, and Elaine quickly interjected, "It's just to help manage household matters in case you ever get sick. You don't have to think about it, just trust us." I took the papers, flipped through them slowly, and though I did not understand every clause, I saw enough words like authority, transfer, and responsibility to know precisely what they were. Attempting. I set the papers down carefully and said I would read them later, then placed them in a drawer and locked it. That night I copied every page by hand into my notebook, line by line, because I knew that the moment I refused to sign, they would attempt to take the originals away. The humiliations grew smaller but more frequent, each one designed to chip away at my dignity. At a restaurant one Saturday, Elaine ordered for me without asking, telling the waiter I could not handle spicy food, though I had always enjoyed it. Peter insisted on counting out change for me at the counter of a grocery store, loudly explaining to the cashier that he gets mixed up with numbers these days. Once, when I made a remark about a neighbor who had passed away, Elaine patted my hand and said gently, "That was months ago, Dad. Don't you remember?" I knew very well that the funeral had been last week. I had been there. But she wanted to create doubt not only in the minds of others but in mine. It is a cruel form of manipulation, to present falsehoods so confidently that you begin to question your own certainty, but I refused to yield to that trap. Instead, I wrote it down in my notebook. She said it was months ago. The truth, 1 week. I remember the flowers, the eulogy, the date on the program. Slowly, I came to realize that this was not merely impatience with an old man, but a coordinated erosion of my identity. They were constructing a case, not in a courtroom yet, but in the court of perception, laying the groundwork for the claim that I was no longer competent to live or decide for myself. Their smiles masked the strategy, their laughter disguised the cruelty, but beneath it all was calculation. I saw it especially in Peter's eyes, that flicker of satisfaction whenever Elaine corrected me, whenever Matthew laughed at my expense. He was watching the story take shape, the story in which I would become the helpless old man needing guardianship, and he was pleased with its progress. There was one moment that remains seared in my mind, a moment when the mask slipped. Elaine and Peter were in the kitchen while I sat in the living room pretending to doze. Their voices carried just enough for me to hear Peter say, "The sooner we establish incapacity, the sooner we can get control. Otherwise, everything will just sit in limbo until—" He trailed off, but Elaine finished the sentence in a whisper I could barely make out. "Until he's gone." They did not laugh that time. The silence that followed was heavier than laughter, more chilling, because it confirmed that this was no longer a vague intention, but a plan with timelines and consequences. I closed my eyes tighter, forced my breathing into the rhythm of sleep, and felt my chest constrict with a mixture of fear and fury. That night, more than ever, I understood the precariousness of my position. They believed they were dealing with a man too deaf, too confused, too fragile to notice what was happening, but I was very much aware, and my awareness was my only weapon. Every slight, every lie, every attempt to push me into the shadows became another entry in my growing record, the secret chronicle of their betrayal. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink smudged beneath my fingers, until the notebook felt like a lifeline binding me to the truth. I promised myself that no matter how long this charade continued, I would not let them erase me quietly. If they wanted to strip me of my life and home, they would first have to face the full clarity of the man they believed deaf and blind. This was the first true escalation, the point at which suspicion hardened into certainty, at which daily life became a battlefield fought not with raised voices but with subtle words and calculated humiliations. They had underestimated me, and in that underestimation lay my strength. I was old, yes, but not broken, and if they thought their laughter would silence me, they would learn in time that it had only awakened a resolve fiercer than they imagined. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon when Elaine invited me to join the family for lunch at a nearby restaurant, a place I had not been to before, one of those bright modern establishments with wide windows and music playing softly overhead. I had been reluctant to go, because lately every outing seemed to carry with it some new humiliation. Yet I told myself that perhaps this time it might be different. Perhaps this was her attempt to rebuild something between us. Perhaps she wanted her. children to see me as part of the family again. I dressed with care, put on my best tie, polished the cane I had inherited from my father, and arrived a few minutes early, sitting outside on the bench to enjoy the weak sunlight. When they came, Elaine smiled quickly. Peter gave a curt nod, and the grandchildren walked ahead without greeting, already absorbed in their phones. Inside, the table had been reserved, and the waitress handed us menus. I took mine and adjusted my glasses, but before I could decide, Elaine leaned forward and said in a tone that was both sweet and firm, "Dad, don't worry about the menu. I'll order for you." I told her I was perfectly capable of choosing, but she waved me off and informed the waitress, "He'll have the soft fish, steamed vegetables, no seasoning, and just water." I felt my face heat with anger, because I wanted the steak, I wanted the red wine, I wanted the dignity of being allowed to speak for myself, but Peter interrupted with a chuckle. "Better safe than sorry. We don't want him upsetting his stomach again." I said sharply that I had never upset my stomach in years, but Elaine patted my hand and said, "You don't remember, Dad, but last time you did." Matthew and Chloe laughed, and I sat back, the sound of their amusement heavier than the clatter of dishes around us. The meal itself was an exercise in endurance. They carried on conversations across the table, speaking of vacations, investments, and plans, occasionally lowering their voices to discuss matters I was not supposed to hear. Every so often, I caught a phrase: guardianship, doctor's note, retirement facility. Once, when I asked what they meant, they exchanged glances, and Elaine smiled in that way she had begun to smile at me, thin and careful, like a nurse, indulging a difficult patient, and she said, "We'll talk about it later, Dad." I ate my bland food in silence, but inside my fury rose higher with every minute. Then came the moment that seared itself into me forever. Matthew made a sarcastic remark about his grandfather being too slow to keep up with technology, and Chloe added, "He doesn't even hear us half the time." Elaine laughed, not loudly, but with that knowing laugh that confirmed the script she had already written about me. She turned to her children and said, "It's normal at his age. You don't have to be upset if he doesn't respond. He just doesn't understand anymore." And they all laughed together, my daughter, my grandchildren, and my son-in-law, laughing openly while I sat right there at the table, flesh and blood, yet treated as though I were deaf, insensible, already fading from existence. Something broke in me at that moment. I did not slam the table or shout, though every instinct in me screamed to do so. Instead, I lowered my head, took a long breath, and fixed every word into my memory with absolute precision. I knew then that this was no longer just a matter of casual cruelty or thoughtlessness. It was a campaign, deliberate and escalating, to erase me from the dignity of my own life. My own daughter had enlisted my grandchildren into the act, had allowed them to laugh at me, had taught them to see me as a relic rather than as the man who had once held their hands when they crossed the street. The betrayal was almost too heavy to bear, but it clarified something within me with a cold, steady light. I could not allow this to continue. When the meal ended and we walked out into the afternoon sun, Elaine slipped her arm through mine and said softly, "You see, Dad, you need us more than you think." Her words were meant to be comforting, but I heard the iron beneath them, the warning that soon they would move from laughter to action. I smiled faintly, nodded, and told her I appreciated her care, but inside I was already planning my response. I would not confront them yet. I would wait. I would gather. I would ensure that when the moment came I could repeat every word they had spoken, not as a confused old man defending himself, but as a witness presenting testimony. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote down the entire scene, every phrase, every laugh, the exact order of words as they had been spoken, until my hand ached and the ink smudged on the paper. I underlined the sentence that had cut deepest. "He doesn't even hear us." I stared at it for a long time, and then I wrote beneath it in capital letters. But I heard everything. This was the midpoint, the place where everything shifted. Until then, I had been enduring, hoping perhaps that they would come to their senses, that their greed and impatience were temporary shadows. But hearing my daughter, my own flesh, instructing her children to laugh at me as if I were already gone, burned away any illusions I had left. It was no longer about suspicion or disappointment, it was about survival, of my dignity, of my independence, of my very identity. And I swore to myself that the day would come when I would stand before them, calm and clear, and repeat every word they had once thought I was too deaf to hear. I began to treat my days like a quiet operation, moving through ordinary routines while behind them I laid out careful lines of defense. And the more I watched, the more their intentions declared themselves in gestures I would once have dismissed as impatience, but now recognized as the coordinated steps of a campaign that assumed I would not notice or would be too timid to resist. And if there was any mercy in their arrogance, it was that they believed their own story about me so completely that they grew careless in ways that handed me the very proof I needed. Elaine started helping with my medications by appearing with a little plastic organizer she said a pharmacist had recommended, an act wrapped in the silk of concern yet sticky with control, and I thanked her, told her it would be useful. Then counted the tablets in the kitchen after she left and found 2 extra antihistamines tucked among my evening pills that would have left me drowsy and unsteady enough to appear confused if I had swallowed them without looking. I wrote down the date and the count in my notebook and placed the 2 tablets in an envelope I labeled in block letters, because I knew that one day a small envelope might weigh more than tears. Peter, for his part, developed a habit of dropping by on the way to a meeting, straightening a picture frame and then leaving it deliberately askew so that he could tease me later about not noticing details, and once he turned on the back burner of the stove without lighting it, and then made a show of sniffing the air as though I had forgotten it myself. The flame did not catch, the gas did not flow, because I keep the knobs locked now as a matter of habit since Margaret passed, a habit I never abandoned. And when Peter frowned and said, almost to himself, that perhaps the locks should be removed because they were inconvenient, I smiled and offered him coffee, then wrote the incident down with the same calm precision I applied to every insult because precision was the counterweight to their fog. My primary physician called me for a routine check, except the appointment had not been scheduled by me, and when I arrived the nurse had a clipboard with a cognitive screening form already printed with my name, and she looked embarrassed when she realized I had not been warned. I completed the questions, recited the words, drew the clock, named the objects, and then asked quietly whether anyone else had requested the evaluation, and the nurse hesitated before saying that my daughter had phoned, worried I might be slipping, and I said I appreciated her concern and requested a copy of the results for my records, which the doctor, a decent man with tired eyes, provided without fuss after noting that everything was normal for my age and that I remained capable of managing my affairs. On my way home, I stopped by the audiology clinic an old colleague had once recommended and sat through the beeps and tones and the muffled consonants that measure humiliation more than hearing. And when the audiologist showed me the chart, she said my hearing was within the range one would expect for a man of my years. Not perfect, but far from the caricature of deafness my family had begun to enjoy. And I purchased no hearing aids, only the report, which I slid into the folder where I kept the medical summary, the pill envelope, the photocopies of the routine paperwork Peter had tried to pass across my kitchen table. The bank provided its own chapter in this unfolding text. I received a call from a manager named Laura, who had always treated me with the kind of respectful briskness that restores a man to himself, and she said, in a neutral tone that barely concealed warning, that she had received an inquiry from my daughter about adding herself as a convenience signer on my checking account, a phrase that braided convenience with surrender, and I told Laura that no one would be added. Not now. Not ever the account. And she said she would flag the account for attempts to change authority and would send me a notice to confirm my wishes in writing. And I thanked her, then added that I would like alerts for any transactions above a modest amount, because sometimes it is prudent to install bells on the doors even in your own home. That same week, a letter arrived addressed to me but care of Elaine's address, a sloppiness that can only happen when people are moving faster than their conscience, and inside was a glossy brochure for a memory care community, with cheerful photos of people my age being led across gardens like obedient children, and a sticky note in Elaine's handwriting said, "Brunch Sunday," which I knew in my bones was a code for a guided tour disguised as a family outing. I called her and said I would be delighted to see a new place for brunch if the food was as good as the photos, and she laughed softly and said, I would love the menu. And when Sunday came, Peter drove and the grandchildren sat in the back taking videos of the sidewalk and laughing at filters while Elaine talked brightly about amenities as if she were introducing me to a resort. But as soon as the receptionist clipped a name tag to my shirt and asked if there was any wandering history in the last month, I excused myself to the restroom, peeled the tag off, and threw it away because I would not let even adhesive claim me. The tour guide spoke in the tone of a kindergarten teacher, explaining activities and structured days and safe kitchens, and Peter asked almost casually about waiting lists and whether power of attorney was required for admission, and while the guide explained procedures. Elaine looked at me with an expression crafted to look loving, and I returned it with a long look that contained all the Sundays of her childhood when she had run laughing into my arms, because I needed her to see what she was, trading. I made it through the tour, thanked the guide, and on the sidewalk told Elaine I had promised myself a slice of lemon pie at the diner across the street, and that I would meet them there. And when I reached the diner, I found a booth by the window and wrote every sentence into the notebook until the waitress asked whether I wanted dessert first or coffee, and I ordered both, because strong coffee and tart lemon can keep a man from collapsing under the weight of betrayal. And when the family entered, Peter scolded me for wandering, and Elaine announced gently to the waitress that I sometimes got mixed up, and I smiled and asked for the check before dinner was served, then paid it and said I was tired and would take a cab home, and as I left, Peter muttered that this was exactly the kind of behavior that proved their point, and I filed the phrase beside the others like a bead on a rosary of resolve. In the margins of this campaign appeared my neighbors, people who exist on the edges of one's life until suddenly they step forward as essential witnesses, and I will always be grateful for Mrs. Kaplan, across the street, who came over with a casserole because she said I looked thinner, and because older women always know when men are living on coffee and recollection. And as we ate, she asked gently whether everything was all right with Elaine, because she had seen Peter one afternoon fiddling with the smoke detector outside my kitchen and then glancing at his watch as though waiting for something. And when I asked what day that had been, she named it, and I remembered that later that same evening. Elaine had arrived with her soft voice full of concern because a neighbor had reported they heard a beeping alarm in my house, and I realized Peter had been rehearsing a narrative of negligence for anybody willing to listen. I told Mrs. Kaplan that sometimes families got tangled up in worry and that I was keeping notes because notes stabilize the ground beneath your feet, and she put her hand on mine and said that if I ever needed someone to speak truthfully about what she had seen, she would not hesitate, because widows do not forget what it feels like to be managed by people who believe they are doing good while they erase you. A few days later, the mailman accidentally left an envelope for Peter at my door, and since I knew he would come by in the evening, I did not open it. But the return address, a private lender with the kind of name that substitutes marble for mercy, told me more than I wanted to know. When Peter arrived, he snatched the envelope with a forced lightness and said it was nothing, and I thought about the way Elaine's voice grew tight when she spoke about bills and the way she admired kitchens she could not afford, and I understood that their urgency was a mixture of greed and fear, not simply cruelty but the cold arithmetic of people sinking into debt who decide to turn a parent into a solution. One morning, a social worker knocked softly and introduced herself with the slight embarrassment of someone assigned to an uncomfortable task, and she said she was following up on a report from a family member about concerns for my safety. And I invited her in, brewed coffee, showed her the pill envelope and the audiology report and the physician's notes and the notebook where I had written the dates and words that mark the path from casual disrespect to planned dispossession. And she read. Quietly, asked careful questions, and then closed the folder and said that while family tensions were not within her power to resolve, she could note in her file that I was oriented, supported, and in possession of my faculties, and that if any future petition were filed it would not be able to rely on the presumption of incapacity, and I thanked her, aware that even small official sentences can become bridges over rivers you never meant to cross. After she left, I sat at the table where Margaret and I once paid the mortgage and decided that the time for passive vigilance had ended, because I could feel the ground shifting beneath me toward a hearing or a signature trap or an engineered incident that would let them move quickly. And if I had learned anything from years of teaching, it was that the test seldom arrives without warning, but always sooner than you think. So I gathered my folder and my notebook, made a list of the words CUDI I would carry intact from my mouth to a lawyer's ear, and prepared for the moment when I would no longer pretend to be deaf but would speak with the clarity of a man who has listened carefully to every syllable spoken over him. The day I carried my folder to the lawyer's office, the weight of it felt heavier than stone. Not because of its physical mass, but because every page inside was soaked with weeks of humiliation, whispered betrayals, and the laughter of people who thought I was too deaf or too senile to defend myself. I had rehearsed the words in my head night after night until they became a litany, and when the lawyer, a calm man with silver hair and glasses perched low on his nose, asked me to sit down, I opened the folder with hands that trembled not from age, but from the gravity of the moment. I told him I wanted to dictate something to him exactly as it happened, without summary, without embellishment, and I began to repeat the phrases I had memorized from that cursed dinner, every line of contempt spoken by my daughter and her husband, the exact words they had believed were lost in the fog of my ears. He doesn't even listen anymore. We'll get the papers sorted. It will be easier once we establish that he can't manage on his own. The lawyer listened in silence, his pen moving steadily across the pad, and when I paused, he nodded gravely, saying, "Go on." I gave him more. The fabricated stories they had told. About me forgetting to turn off the stove, about spilling food, about confusing dates. The staged acts meant to portray me as incapable. I showed him the notebook, each entry dated, my cramped handwriting recording the humiliations like evidence. I pulled out the copy of the document Peter had once tried to make me sign, its language dripping with the transfer of authority. I presented the envelope with the pills, the audiologist's report, the physician's declaration that my memory was intact, the statement from the social worker who had visited my home. Piece by piece, I laid before him the anatomy of a betrayal that had stretched from sly laughter to attempted financial capture. The lawyer did not interrupt, though I saw his eyebrows rise, his mouth tighten, the small gestures of a man accustomed to human deceit, yet still appalled by the cruelty of children toward a parent. When at last I had finished, when my voice had grown hoarse and the table between us was covered with papers, he leaned back and said, "Mr. Ellis, you have done exactly the right thing. Everything you have here points to a clear attempt to undermine your independence and prepare a fraudulent guardianship case. It is not only morally despicable, it is legally actionable." For a long moment I simply sat there, letting his words sink in, because though I had known it in my bones, hearing another voice confirm it gave the reality a shape I could finally grip. The next weeks were consumed with meetings, affidavits, notarized statements. The lawyer prepared a petition to safeguard my estate, and I signed it with steady hands. He told me that my daughter and her husband would soon receive notice of my legal counteraction, and that when they did, they would be summoned to respond. I imagined the look on their faces when they realized the man they had thought too deaf to hear had remembered every syllable, preserved it, and carried it intact to the very place where words become judgment. That day came faster than I expected. We met in a conference room, sterile and bright, the kind of place where family ties are stripped of sentiment and examined under the cold light of legality. Elaine entered first, her expression carefully arranged into wounded innocence. Peter close behind her with his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of contempt and unease. I sat at the table already, the lawyer beside me, my folder of evidence stacked neatly before me. Elaine gave me a smile that in another life might have softened me, but I had learned that behind it lived nothing but calculation. The session began, and their lawyer immediately launched into a narrative of concern, painting me as a confused old man, prone to forgetfulness, incapable of managing accounts or property. He spoke of their selfless desire to protect me, their fear that without their guidance I would fall prey to fraud or mismanage my funds. I sat still, hands folded, as though I were indeed the frail figure they described, and when he finished, my lawyer simply opened the folder and began to lay down each piece, one by one, like cards in a game they had already lost. The transcript of my physician's clean report, the audiologist's test results, the social worker's statement, the photocopies of the documents Peter had slid across my table, and, finally, the notebook, its pages filled with my careful handwriting. "Mr. Ellis, would you please read aloud the entry dated April 17th? My lawyer asked. I adjusted my glasses and read in a clear voice, "Dinner at Elaine's house." She whispered to Peter, "He doesn't even listen anymore. Half the time he doesn't know what we're talking about. We'll have to get the papers sorted soon." Peter replied, "Better sooner than later. Otherwise, the house will just sit there, and the accounts too." I looked up when I finished, and for the first time in years I felt my daughter's eyes flinch under mine. The room grew silent except for the faint scratch of my lawyer's pen as he noted the moment. Peter shifted in his chair, his face flushing red, and Elaine stammered, "He must have misunderstood. Dad, you misheard." But my lawyer cut her off. Then explain why he was able to repeat the exact phrases, word for word, across multiple occasions, corroborated by his contemporaneous notes, and why those words align precisely with the documents you attempted to place in front of him. Elaine's mouth opened and closed, but no answer came. By the time the session ended, it was clear to all present that the attempt to portray me as incompetent had collapsed. Their lawyers' arguments had withered under the weight of evidence, and though they muttered protests, the truth had been carved into the record. As we rose to leave, I turned to Elaine and Peter and said, not loudly but with the quiet firmness of a verdict, "You laughed because you thought I could not hear. I heard every word. And now, so has the law." Walking out of that building, I felt no triumph, no exultation, only a vast, weary relief. The battle had reached its turning point. The years of being diminished had been reversed in a single moment of clarity. I had stood not as a broken old man, but as myself, whole and undeniable, and in their silence I knew they finally saw it too. In the weeks after that meeting, life did not transform into a parade of victories or a tidy moral pageant. It simply steadied, which for a man who had been forced to watch his own family rehearse his disappearance felt as close to grace as I had any right to expect, and I set about securing that steadiness with the same patient thoroughness I had once brought to grading essays and mending leaky gutters. The lawyer filed what needed filing so there would be a record thick enough to stand between me and any renewed attempt to seize my choices, and at his suggestion, I established a living trust with a bank fiduciary named as successor trustee. A quiet, competent woman who spoke plainly and wrote more plainly still, and I sat with Laura at the branch while we moved the accounts under that shelter and added alerts that would ring like bells if anything odd brushed against them. Not because I wanted to live suspiciously, but because vigilance is not paranoia when you have seen how easily love can be dressed in the language of protection. I updated my health directives too, naming the doctor who actually listens to me, and left copies with the social worker who had come to my kitchen and told me, kindly and professionally, that clear paper can stop 1,000 vague stories. I declined to pursue charges, though my lawyer said there were grounds, because I did not want to spend the remainder of my days chasing punishments for people who had already punished themselves by choosing greed over simple decency. Yet I insisted. On a written stipulation their side signed that acknowledged my capacity and forbade them from representing otherwise to any institution. And when the envelope arrived with their signatures, I placed it in the folder with the audiogram, the pill, envelope, the diary pages, and felt a knot in my chest loosen as if a small stone had finally rolled off the shelf where it had balanced for months. Elaine telephoned twice, leaving messages soaked in a kind of hurt surprise that I would not meet for coffee, and Peter texted a paragraph that tried to fold everything into apology and misunderstanding. But I knew the difference now between regret for consequences and remorse for actions, and so I answered with a letter written slowly at my desk, the same desk where Margaret once addressed Christmas cards, and I told them that I wished them peace and solvency and every good thing that does not require the erasure of another person, and that for the sake of my health and dignity, I would be stepping back from contact until they could acknowledge without hedging or excuse what they had done. I did not make threats or demands. I simply drew a boundary and signed my name as the man they had insisted did not exist. For the grandchildren I wrote separate notes, longer than the hurried texts that pass for conversation now, and I told them about the first time each of them put a hand around my thumb and laughed, and about the library where I volunteer and the little boy who sounded out river like a triumph. And I said that if they ever wished to visit me on their own, without a chorus of explanations or the glow of someone else's phone, my door would be open and the kettle would be on. And if they chose not to, I would still hope that life gives them the kind of love you do not need to earn by pretending someone else is smaller than they are. Mrs. Kaplan brought over a pie and sat with me on the porch while we watched the late sun stretch itself across the roofs, and she said that calm suits me, and that perhaps calm is the revenge none of us admit we want, and I laughed because I had not thought of it that way. But she was right. The true reversal was not in the paperwork or the stipulations, but in the way the air in my house had become breathable again, in the way I no longer flinched when the phone rang, in the way coffee tasted like coffee and not like a calculation about who might take the mug from my hand. I did a small foolish thing one Saturday. I drove just around the block after the optometrist fitted me with new lenses and the doctor cleared me for short daytime trips. And when I parked again in front of my own curb, I sat for a long time with both hands on the wheel and thanked Margaret out loud for the way she used to squeeze my shoulder at red lights, because gratitude, like grief, is a habit that keeps a person honest. I changed nothing dramatic in the house. I did not rip photographs from frames or sell furniture in a fit of reinvention. I only finally hung the clock that had gone unwound during all those weeks of tension, and the reliable ticking felt like a metronome set to the tempo of ordinary life, which is to say, hope disguised as routine. I returned to the library on Wednesdays, where a girl with braids asked if I could show her the trick for remembering where the silent letters hide, and I told her that many of the most important things in the world are silent and still demand to be heard, and she nodded gravely in the way children do when they understand more than we credit them for. Now and then I pass the restaurant where the laughter broke something I had not realized could break, and I do not cross the street anymore. I simply walk by and let the memory slide past like the shadow of a bird that does not decide where you look. I no longer repeat the cruel sentences at night to prove to myself that I remember. I repeat instead the words the lawyer used: legally actionable, capacity affirmed. And then I set all the words down and listen to the house breathe. It may be that Elaine will one day find a way to speak plainly and without varnish. And if that day comes, I imagine we will sit at this kitchen table and accept that neither of us is who the other once needed, but both of us are still bound to a woman whose laugh could soften storms, and on that narrow bridge we might meet. It may also be that such a day will not come, that each of us will carry our convictions to the end, and if so, I will carry mine without bitterness, because bitterness is just another form of custody, and I have had enough of custody for several lifetimes. I rewrote my will and left most of what I have to the local scholarship fund for students who want to teach, along with a gift to the library to buy large print books that do not apologize for the size of their letters, and as I signed the papers, Itamimwiri felt a steadiness that did not require any audience, as if the circle that had been scratched and scuffed had finally closed. In the mornings, I still make 2 slices of toast, one for me and one for the birds, and I still speak to Margaret when the kettle clicks off, not because I am confused, but because conversation is another word for memory. And I have chosen, at last, what I want to hear: the hum of the refrigerator, the crunch of gravel under a neighbor's tires, the laughter of a child outside, the firm, unembarrassed ticking of a clock that says, in its own language, that the time you have is precisely enough if you refuse to let anyone spend it for you.